Canada is holding one of the most important building materials that America cannot easily replace. Lumber crossing the border now costs far more, but U.S. homebuilders still need it for new homes. The trade fight has changed the market, and the biggest pressure is now falling on the American housing industry. A 10% Section 232 national security tariff on lumber imports took effect. Stacking directly on top of the existing anti-dumping and countervailing duty structure, the Commerce Department had already more than doubled earlier in the year. The combined result: an effective tariff rate of approximately 45% on most Canadian softwood lumber entering the United States. Canadian lumber cleared the U.S. border at about 165 U.S. per cubic meter in Q1 2026. The next cheapest alternative sources, German, Swedish, and Brazilian lumber, averaged between 274 and 307 US per cubic meter. American homebuilders are paying 45% more for a material they cannot replace at anywhere near the same price from anywhere else on Earth. The dispute producing this tariff stack has been running almost continuously since 1982. That is, 44 years of anti-dumping investigations, countervailing duty orders, NAFTA panel proceedings, WTO rulings, London Court of International Arbitration findings, and 2 bilateral softwood lumber agreements, the most recent of which expired in October 2015 and has not been replaced. The core American allegation across all 4 decades of the dispute is the same. Canadian provinces allow timber companies to harvest softwood on Crown land at stumpage fees set administratively below market rates, constituting a government subsidy that allows Canadian producers to undercut American mill prices. Canada disputes that characterization, and international trade tribunals have repeatedly ruled in Canada's favor. American trade remedy authorities have consistently found otherwise. The disagreement about whether Canadian lumber is subsidized has never been resolved, which is why no permanent bilateral agreement exists and why the tariff rate has been an active dispute for longer than most American homebuilders have been in business. The 2025 escalation followed a specific administrative sequence. The Commerce Department issued preliminary anti-dumping and countervailing duty determinations in 2024 that pushed the combined rate from 14.5% to approximately 35%. The Wall Street Journal reported in July 2025 that Canadian lumber was hit with a higher anti-dumping duty as Commerce continued its review. Then on October 14th, 2025, the Section 232 proclamation added a flat 10% national security tariff on top of the existing AD-CVD structure, citing the same national security authority the administration used for steel and aluminum, with Commerce directed to implement an inclusions process to add additional wood products to the tariff scope. The combined 45% rate that resulted from that stacking is what drove U.S. framing lumber prices 30% higher off their December 2025 lows. The pricing data that defines how completely American builders are trapped in this situation comes from Q1 2026 trade statistics. Canada supplied 84% of all U.S. softwood lumber imports in Q1 2026, down from higher historical levels, but still an overwhelming dominance of the import market. At 165 US per cubic meter, Canadian lumber arrived at approximately 54 to 60% of the cost of the next available alternatives. German, Swedish, and Brazilian lumber averaged 274 to 307 US per cubic meter. Those alternatives face their own logistics constraints. Longer shipping distances, different species mixes that do not substitute perfectly for North American dimensional framing lumber specifications, and supply volumes that are a fraction of Canada's annual export capacity. Canada exports approximately 12 billion board feet to the United States annually. The entire rest of the world's exportable softwood lumber supply does not come close to replacing that volume. The NAHB has calculated that combined tariffs and duties have added at least $10,000 to the construction cost of a new single-family American home. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce projects that the combined tariff burden could add as much as $14,000 to the cost of building a U.S. home by 2027 if the current rate structure persists. Those two estimates, $10,000 from the American Homebuilders' own trade association, $14,000 projected by Canadian trade body bracket, the direct material cost impact without capturing the risk premiums builders add on top of material costs to protect against further volatility, or the financing cost escalation that project delays produce when material availability uncertainty pushes construction timelines out. The additional Section 232 duties on softwood lumber will make it even harder and more expensive to build new homes at a time when our country is facing a severe housing affordability crisis, the NAHB stated in its formal response to the October 2025 Section 232 proclamation. Full year 2025 single-family housing starts fell 7% to 943,000 units, the weakest annual result since the pandemic recovery. U.S. softwood lumber imports fell 24% year-on-year in Q1 2026 to 6.2 million cubic meters, despite Canada maintaining 84% market share of what was imported, meaning the total volume imported contracted severely, while Canada's relative dominance of that contracted market remained. American domestic production did not fill the gap. The tariff architects expected higher duties to incentivize domestic mill expansion. That expansion has not materialized at the scale required because the capital required to build a greenfield sawmill, the timber supply needed to feed it, and the workforce required to operate it all face constraints that do not resolve in a 12-month tariff cycle. The irony embedded in the supply data is documented in what happened to Canfor, one of Canada's largest lumber producers. Canfor permanently closed its Estill and Darlington mills in South Carolina in August 2025, removing 350 million board feet of annual capacity from the North American supply chain. Those were American mills producing American lumber for American builders. The tariff environment that was supposed to encourage domestic production created a cost structure that instead eliminated existing capacity, reducing supply on both sides of the border simultaneously. A tariff intended to strengthen American lumber production contributed to the permanent closure of American milling capacity because the integrated economics of North American lumber do not separate cleanly by country of origin. The April 2026 preliminary Commerce Department determination reduced the anti-dumping component of the rate to 24.83%, a 10 percentage point reduction from the previous preliminary figure. That revision brought the combined anti-dumping and countervailing component to 24.83%. The Section 232 10% tariff sits separately and was not modified by the Commerce Review, holding the effective combined rate at 34.83% until the final determination expected in late August 2026. The MPA Magazine analysis of the CUSMA non-renewal confirmed that the July 1st U.S. decision not to extend the agreement deepens Canadian lumber uncertainty for U.S. builders, removing the trade framework that would have provided the clearest pathway to a negotiated reduction of the AD/CVD duties through a renewed bilateral softwood lumber agreement. Wood and panels reporting on Canadian lumber tariffs driving U.S. framing costs higher confirmed that builders are facing intensifying material pressure with no near-term relief mechanism visible. The final Commerce determination in late August 2026 could move the AD/CVD rate up or down from the current 24.83% preliminary figure. The Section 232 rate requires a separate presidential action. Bilateral trade negotiations on lumber specifically have not been scheduled. The CUSMA annual review process that replaced the 16-year extension Canada sought creates a year-by-year uncertainty environment rather than the stable long-term framework within which a softwood lumber agreement would typically be negotiated. American builders planning projects in 2026 and 2027 are making material cost assumptions against a tariff backdrop that four separate simultaneous policy processes, Commerce AD, CVD review, Section 232 administration, CUSMA annual review, and bilateral trade negotiations could change in any direction on any of their individual timelines. Canadian softwood cleared U.S. customs at $165 per cubic meter in Q1 2026. The next available source cost $274 per cubic meter. The gap between those two numbers is where American homebuilders are trapped, and that gap exists regardless of what the tariff rate is, because the tariff is applied to the $165 per cubic meter product rather than to the $109 cost differential that separates it from its closest alternative.